Hey all, it's Matt. I'm back for an update on the layout. I spent some time building the turnouts that get from the main into the old main. This one is the first switch off the eastbound main onto the old main. And here I'm just laying out the diverging curve and getting the points set in the right place relative to the running rail from the eastbound main. Here's kind of a quick view of what's going to look like once it's done. You can see the old main going to the center. Um, for this switch, I decided to lay it in place on the homicide. Worked really well. I mean, homicide, as everybody knows, takes spikes really well. Um, the thing I hadn't thought yet about at this point was how I was going to get the switch off the homicide once I was done. But I'll come to that. Here I'm just checking the diverging route, making sure it's good. Now I'm building the points and the wing rail. I used the fast track fixture to get the dimensions right on this. It was pretty handy for that purpose. I wasn't going to try to reinvent the wheel. So once that was done, I could just spike it down into place. One nice thing about spiking directly to the homicide is it's really easy just to remove a rail and make marks or file things as needed. After a quick file to get the base of the rail removed for the point and a bend with the rail roller to get the diverging rail radius about right. I think it makes it a little easier to lay that rail since you're not fighting with the bend. After that, I was reinserted the rail and it's about ready time to remove it from its build spot. And it was about that time I started thinking how I was going to remove it. So I settled on the idea of just soldering some straps across the top of the turnout to hold everything in place and then remove it. Turned out to be a lot harder than I expected because I was using PC board ties for this, and it's really hard to get the heat into the bottom foil to make it solder to the track. So after fighting with that for a while, I was able to get enough of the ties in place that I was able to remove the turnout as a whole piece. So now it's on to getting the ties on the right side of the rail. I spaced these thinking I would use the Central Valley ties to fill in the spaces between the PC board ties. So here I'm just kind of trying to decide what that spacing should be so I get the ties in the right place. And then it was on to cutting up some CV Central Valley ties to fit into those gaps. So I printed off a template and just kind of worked out how things would work space and then chopped up some ties in order to insert them. This is my plan at this point. I later changed my mind on this just because, for various reasons, they didn't quite work the way I wanted them to. Which is unfortunate, but that's why you experiment, I guess. And once all up was done, it was time to clean up. Here I'm scraping off the solder left over from the straps I had soldered across the top of the rail. Might be a better way to do this than a flat blade X-Acto, but this did work. And here's the end result in its final location. Next is on just the final steps of getting the guardrails put in place. Here's turned out to be a little bit of a bear just because some of the place I needed to mount those guardrails were over that foam, so it's a bit hard to spike them in place in a way that they would stay there until I was done soldering. But it got worked out. With that, the first turnout was done. Once that was done, I cleaned out some of that foam I was referring to earlier. I used my favorite tool, oscillating saw, to cut that out and also put a bevel on the homicide itself. Put some sculpting mold in to give it a little bit of scenic base, and it was ready to move on to the crossovers, something I was not looking forward to.
The reason I wasn't looking forward to the crosser is because they're both on curves. One was on the meat of a 42-inch radius curve, and the other was on a spiral towards a tangent. So I just used the tools I was familiar with. I used my wood radius tool there to make sure the crossing track did not go under my minimum radius of 30 inches. Then I used a ruler to kind of figure out my frog angle. I wanted to stick with around a number 8 since that's what my main line standard is. And once I had all that worked out and got the rail cut, it was time to assemble the frog points themselves. So I set that up by first bending the rail to the approximate radius of what I needed. Filed the point at the end using a Fast Track's point form tool. Then weighted them both down using 1, 2, 3 blocks on the back side of a Fast Track's aluminum fixture, but any flat surface would work. Then the point itself I held together with a couple of T-pins staked down into my home soak roadbed. So overall it worked out pretty well, and it gave me a solid platform to solder on. So now it's time to start some assembly, first of the crossing track. Things that I ran into a problem with was that the white stuff down the middle is sculptable, which won't hold spikes. I needed some way to support the rail, so made some temporary ties, and these ties at first used my custom thickness sander to bring the tie down to 72 thousandths thick, which is the same height as a Central Valley tie, including the tie plate. Once that was in place, I could then had something to spike through without having to worry about the rail pressing down to the surface of the roadbed. And once they were good and solid, I started working on getting the PC board ties cut and placed. I struggled with this a little bit because I wasn't really sure what the layout of the ties should be on a crossover, let alone on a curved one. So I spent some time thinking and cutting and filing and getting things right. And I was using Central Valley ties here to try to make sure the spacing of the ties was good, wasn't too tight, wasn't too loose. And I used these squares to make sure the ties I was putting in place were 90 degrees from the center line of the rail. And once I was happy with that, flexed them up and got them soldered so I could get ready to move on to the next step in this project. Next step was to get the point rail in place on the eastbound track, and because all this rail is now anchored, I couldn't just lift the rail up and put it on a tool to file the base of the rail away. So I used a Dremel tool, cutoff wheel, and just cut at an angle to cut away that rail base. Then cut away the ties and took a file to the cut area to kind of clean it up enough so that the point rail would fit into it nicely. And it's not super pretty, but no one's going to see it, and it works fine. Then anchor the rail in place so I could prepare it for soldering. Learning on the fly here, I had to clean up some of the tie detail to make sure the points would swing smoothly. I should say here that my goal wasn't to have a fully functioning double track crossover. It was to be able to cross over from the westbound main side close to the fascia to the eastbound main so I could get into Circleville and to my switching district.
As it turned out, that additional turnout was going to be a real troublesome one. Just a quick clip of me getting started here, getting ready to put the points in. This one went pretty much build-wise the same as the other one, except I had a lot of trouble with the frog that caused much cursing. So I think that was because the diverging leg was on a curve as opposed to the previous turnout, which was more or less a straight diverging route. I also tried to build it with the wing rail bends offset from one another, like you see in this image here. And I got that idea from a drawing that I found in the 1929 Maintenance Encyclopedia. This is a wonderful book, by the way, but you can see here that the wing rail bends are in fact offset. And as an aside, this drawing also does a great job of illustrating how they use the ties on a crossover. You can see they use two ties for each location, and the breaks between the two ties are in different places. Some in the crotch, some in the center, some in the other crotch. I thought that was pretty interesting, and I did practice that once I got the turnout done. So I ended up with just a regular symmetrical wing rail bend, and all that rail you see in the top of this picture, that's all the scrap I went through. So this is my 6th attempt to get it right. Once I did get it done, I finished up with a test with my two biggest locomotives, this being a Y6, which would be appropriate, a little bit too modern for my era, but it went through no problem. And this be on the safe side because the Y actually has a pretty short rigid wheelbase. I get out my long wheelbase locomotive, which is my first brass locomotive, a Pennsy J. If you watch closely, you'll see that all the drivers and the leading truck of both locomotives would drop down in that frog, so I may have to end up filling it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.